I'll give you a little tour here of the underquilt I made. It's a boxed underquilt that I sewed out of 6-ounce Climashield Apex. I have box corners on all of the sides, and I have a sidewall here sewn in so that this insulation fabric isn't being pinched and it's able to loft out. I don't know if you can see what I'm describing here with my fingers, but I'm touching the insulation and it's pretty much fully lofted. It's a 2-inch loft on the insulation, so there's no compression here at the corners. I attached my suspension attachment points, these snaps, to the lining fabric so that the whole body of the underquilt and the insulation can just hang from that. And these are cam snaps, so they snap open. Let's see if I can do that with one hand. Yeah, they snap open, it's looped through, and they snap closed, and then I can take my suspension off when I wash the quilt. I have all my materials laid out here today. I have 1 ounce Hyper D ripstop nylon in Spectra yellow with matching thread. I have charcoal gray 0.66 ounce membrane ripstop nylon, also with matching thread. This is the Gutermann thread. I have Climashield Apex that I got from Dutch. I have a big roll of that. I'm going to attach the underquilt to the suspension with a 1-inch polypropylene webbing that I'm going to fold over and attach with a cam snap. This is just a prototype that I've done. I'm going to have a portion that's sewn into the actual underquilt, and then it'll be rolled over in a snap, put in place. The snaps have 4 parts. There's a cap for each, and then there is the stud and the socket. And the caps are put into the webbing with a tool here. This is to press each one in, and I'm going to need 16 sets of these cam snaps, so I have a little bag of those here. I also have my tools. I've got a rotary cutter, I've got a few pairs of scissors, I have my measuring tape, I also have a straight edge, and I have my little ruler, and I'll also be using a yardstick. So I'm going to measure out and cut the insulation. Just try and be careful that I'm cutting everything on the square. I want to zoom in really close here so that I can show you about the loft needs of the particular insulation that I'm using, because the insulation is going to vary depending on the weight that you decide to use. It has a loft or a height off the table of 2 inches. And so I am going to cut the box edge fabric, the sides of the box for the underquilt, so that they will be 2 inches in height and as a finished box. So I'm going to need a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side, so I will cut those side edges so that they are 3 inches high. Now I'm going to measure the outer fabric and also the lining fabric so that they are the same size as the insulation that I just cut out. Alright, so this will be the outer fabric of the quilt. It will hang down underneath the suspension of the quilt where it attaches, and also underneath the insulation material. Now this strip that I just cut off is the exact length that I need, right? It's the length of the underquilt, but what I need to do is I need to cut off 3-inch strips so that I'm able to sew these to form the box. And that 3-inch again is the 2-inch loft of the insulation plus a 1/2-inch seam allowance on each side. So to do that, I am just going to line it up here and make 3-inch cuts. If you feel like this slippery fabric is moving around on you, you can just take a piece of masking tape and tape it to the board, and that'll keep it from shifting while you're doing your cuts. Alright, so I have 4 strips, the length of my underquilt, that I've cut out of the fabric, and 2 of those are going to form the sides of the box, and then the other 2 are going to form the head and the foot end of the box, and so they don't need to be quite as long. So I'm just going to measure out the width of the underquilt, and I'm just going to cut these off. Now that I have all my fabric cut, I have my lining fabric, I have 2 strips for the ends of my underquilt, I have the outer fabric cut out, and then I have 2 really long strips for the sides of the underquilt. I'm going to move on to preparing the attachment points for the suspension system, and this is the little prototype that I came up with for my design. I'm going to have a piece that is sewn into the quilt, and I've decided instead of just 1 inch inside the quilt, I'm going to make this a little bit longer. That'll give me more of an attachment point to the fabric, but I'm going to have this piece sewn into the quilt, and then I'll have 3 more inches sticking out, and I'll fold over 1 inch, not quite an inch, here, so that I have a place to put a snap with a finished rolled edge, and I'll put the top part of the snap there, and then I'll put the bottom part of the snap here, and then it'll fold over and be, if my thumb is the edge of the fabric, it'll just be sticking up like that. I'm going to attach the snaps after I sew the webbing into the underquilt, and the reason that I am going to attach these last is because if you look at the distance between the snap and my thumb here, if my thumb is the edge of the fabric, there's not room there for the foot of my sewing machine. So to prevent any problems with my ability to actually sew a straight line there and still have a 1-inch tab, I'm going to put the snaps on later. If I put the snaps on first, I'd have to have this sticking out a little bit more, and I want it to pretty much be flush, so I'm going to attach the snaps later. But first thing I need to do is I need to cut out 16 pieces. So I'm going to cut out my polypropylene webbing at 5 inches. I've lit a candle here so that I can seal the edges of the polypropylene webbing, and I want to just melt this a little bit so that I don't get a fray. I don't need to catch it on fire or seal it until it turns brown or black. I just want to melt the edges so that I don't have fraying happening. I'm going to want these bits of webbing as they're put into the seam at the end of the underquilt to be lined up perfectly. And so to do that, I'm going to mark the end that's going to stick out from my hem as I'm sewing, and so I'll have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I want another 1.5 inches to have buried inside the underquilt body, and I want 3 inches sticking out. So I am going to mark at the 1.5 point here on each one and just draw a line so that I can make sure as I'm lining everything up that I've got it perfectly on there and that each one's going to be identical. So I'm just going to mark that with my pencil, just like that. I have the right sides together on my fabric. So I've got the dull side to the dull side, and this is the sidewall and this is the lining fabric. I've got these 8 pieces of webbing with this mark on it, and I'm going to insert these in between the wall, the side wall, and the lining fabric, and I'm going to space these out so that they're all equally spaced. If I subtract from the total length of my fabric here a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides plus another 1/2 inch gap between the seam and the first piece of webbing on each side, and if I also subtract the width of the webbing, I have 8 pieces and they're each 1 inch wide, then that will give me the total amount of space, negative space, the void space that I need to have in between each piece of webbing. And so if I divide that number by 7, it should tell me exactly how to space these as I go down the line, and then I can just measure it with the tape and go down. So I'm going to just measure out and place all of my pieces of webbing, and I'm going to attach them with pieces of masking tape simply because trying to pin through 2 pieces of nylon, it's just very difficult and things are sliding around a lot, and I really want these to be square, so I'm just going to tape them down. Okay, now that I have all of these pinned in place and then taped in place, I'm going to run a basting stitch on my sewing machine. I'm going to run the basting stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is the same seam allowance I'm going to use when I attach my insulation. And the reason that I'm going to use the same basting stitch is I don't want this webbing getting all tripped up on the inside. So I have my thread lined up here in my machine, and I'm going to sew the seam allowance but as a basting stitch. And basting stitches don't really need to be tight. They're not structural. They're just designed to keep things from sliding around. So I'm going to move my stitch width out, and I'm going to just do an easy basting stitch. I'm not going to bother locking my stitches. When I get up to the actual pieces of webbing, I'm just going to remove my tape so that I don't have the problem of sewing through tape and then trying to peel the tape out. You can see my basting stitches here. I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here is my mark that I made on each piece of webbing so that I can line it up properly. Then I have the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and when I invert the fabric, I have the lining fabric and the shell fabric with this guy sticking out. I've got the head end and the foot end with the side walls basted on, and I have it so that I've got a 3-inch piece of webbing peeking out when you open it out. And next I'm going to take the long strips that I cut, pin those to the side, and then sew all the way down. And I'm going to make an effort when I pin these to the corner that I'm not going to catch this fabric. I want this sort of tucked out of the way. That way I can make the box corner here on the corner when I sew these together. I have my sidewall fabric here pinned to the lining fabric. And as you can see, here is my seam from where I sewed it on this edge here. So what I want to do is make sure that I'm not catching any of this web stripping or any of that inside there. So I've just opened that up, and I'm gonna start my seam right here so that I'm not going over those stitches and sewing into that other seam allowance. And again, this is a basting stitch, and it's at a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Because it's a basting stitch, I'm not going to bother to lock my seams right now. All of the side walls are sewn into the lining fabric here. So I've got now my tab sticking out on the head and foot end, and then I've got the sidewall sewn on the both sides of the underquilt. So what I'm going to do next is I will pin in place my insulation, and I'm going to just pin it right underneath this gray lining fabric on the bottom. I have the corner of my lining fabric lined up exactly with the corner of the insulation. And then I'm going to just put in a lot of pins. And I want to make sure when I'm pinning this that I am pinning all the way through the insulation. Because you see, this insulation has, you know, multiple layers, and it has its own sort of fabric edge. So I want to make sure I catch that, and I also want to make sure that I am not going to catch any of this other sidewall when I sew. So I just want to make sure I pull that out of the way so that when I'm running my stitches, I'm only catching what I want to catch with the thread. And the name of the game here is just going to be a lot of pins. I want you to notice how I'm placing my pins. I've got the ball head of the pin facing out and the point of the pin facing in. And the reason for that is so that I can easily remove the pins while I'm sewing. I have my insulation pinned to my lining fabric and my sidewall fabric, and I'm loading this into the sewing machine with the insulation down. This has a lot of frays and fluff that could easily wrap around the feet of your sewing machine here, so you don't want that to happen. So we're going to put the insulation side down, and it'll just get pulled through with the feed dogs. Also, I'm going to make sure that I'm tucking out of the way all of these little bits from the sidewall on the other side. Okay. I'm going to start stitching 1/2 inch in here, and this is going to prevent this from all bunching up in the corner when I turn this inside out. I'll be able to trim that out of the way. So I have my foot down. I have my fabric here all straightened out, and I'm just going to slowly run a stitch. Now when I did the basting stitch, I had the stitches kind of far apart. This is as far apart as my machine will go. I've shortened the stitches now a little bit. I've made them a number 3 on my machine instead of a number 4. And I'm going to lock the stitch. I'm also going to be very careful that I'm not grabbing any of this lining fabric and it's getting looped around inside. So we're just going to go nice and slow. I'm stopping so that my needle is in the down position whenever I stop to make adjustments, and I am going to just exactly follow the stitches that I did the last time. I'm going to try and hit those exactly. Make sure you pull your pins out before you sew over them so that you don't break a needle. If you get a situation like this where you've got some fabric kind of moving in front of the needle, just lift your foot and give that a chance to relax before you keep going, because you don't want to sew over that or you'll get a pucker. And the same thing on this side. As you can see, I've got the fabric on this side here bunching a little bit. I'm just going to lift up the foot, smooth that back out, no big deal. Just keep going. Now that this portion is done, I'm going to reinforce these tabs that come down by just stitching them into the sidewall fabric, and that will allow this to have just a little bit of extra strength as it's holding up the underquilt. So to do that, I'm going to put yellow thread in my machine, and then I'm just going to stitch some X's along this end. I've put yellow thread in my needle and my bobbin, and I'm going to do an X here on the webbing to attach it to the sidewall, just to provide a little bit of additional strength and support. Okay, so now I have the tab here that's going to hold the support for the weight of the underquilt, and I have sewn it here into the sidewall and reinforced that with an X stitch, and I'm just going to do that all the way down the line. I just want to show you what this looks like here. I have the insulation sewn into the lining fabric. And then I have these tabs, and I have sewn each of the tabs into the sidewall fabric with a reinforcement X right there. So as we go down the line, we'll have these tabs that'll eventually have snaps for securing the suspension to the underquilt. We're going to use the Clew suspension. So the next step is I'm going to do the sides and then the other end, and then we will attach the outer fabric to the lining fabric. I've pinned my lining fabric on the long side to the insulation material, and now I'm just going to run a straight seam again right on top of the basting stitch that I did, and I am going to take a lot of care to make sure that I'm not catching any of this in the stitch. And I'm beginning my stitch so that it is right where my other stitch comes across. I'm going to lock that in good and hard. So the quilt now is all sewn onto the lining fabric. I have the reinforced X's on the one side on the tabs, and I'm going to do that now to the other side so that both sides will have the same level of reinforcement. Here's a corner of the underquilt, and as you can see, I've got the wall fabric on this side, and then I also have the wall fabric on this side. And so to make this corner come together, I'm going to, with right sides together, I've pinned this in place, and now I'm going to run a seam right along the corner. So I'm going to do that to all four corners. Here I have another set of corners. I'm just going to line up the corners, put pins in, and then run a seam. As you can see here, I have pinned the corner with the two side walls together so that the right sides are together. And I'm just going to run a seam right down the corner so that it meets right here at the apex. Now when I turn this inside out, I have a nice corner for the quilt, and I have plenty of room between my webbing and the end of the corner so that this didn't get caught up in there. So we'll do this 3 more times. I've pinned the outer fabric to the sidewall fabric all the way around. I've put pins in from corner to corner on all the sides. I'm just going to sew this on the machine, and I've left a space, it's maybe 15 inches wide, where I'm going to not sew. That way I have a place to turn the entire quilt right side out. And so I'll know when to stop sewing because I mark these edges with pins in the shape of the X. So I have a set here, and then I have another set right here. And so in these 2 locations I'm going to start sewing here, sew all the way around the entire quilt, and then when I get back to this point I'll know to stop. So I'm coming up on a corner here, and I want to make sure I do a nice round corner all the way around. So I'm just going to be very slow and careful, line this up the best I can, and just take it right around the corner. I don't want a sharp, pointy corner on this quilt. So I'm coming around. And to make sure I line up my fabric on this side. Even though it's pinned, stuff can move around on you, so just stop and adjust. You can see I've pinned right here through this webbing, but I don't want to sew through this webbing because I don't want a sharp corner of webbing to just sort of poke the end of the suspension. So when I get up to that point, I'm going to just remove the pin and fold that webbing under so that it doesn't get caught by the needle. Here I've got another bit of webbing. I don't want to sew through that webbing, so I'm just going to push it out of the way and then keep sewing. Okay, I'm coming up on this X of pins that I made, which is my signal to myself that that's where I'm to stop sewing so that I can leave a opening in the quilt to turn it right side out. I'm just going to lock the stitch here. Before I turn the quilt right side out, I want to trim these tabs that are hanging down so that they don't poke and make strange bumps in the quilt when it's on the other side. So I'm just going to carefully trim those back. Alright, now that our webbing is trimmed, just going to find where we left our opening and turn our quilt right side out. Now that our quilt is right side out, I'm going to find the opening that we left. I'm going to fold it so that I have the proper seam allowance on both sides. Put some pins in there, and I'm just going to make a straight seam. So the main sewing part of the underquilt is done. We have a box here with a channel sidewall to hold the insulation, and the insulation now has the full room that it needs to loft. And then on the other side we've got boxed corner with the sidewall all the way around. Oh, it looks pretty good. The suspension that I'm designing for the quilt is going to be a Clew suspension, which is the type of suspension that is used on Navy hammocks from the old days. So to attach that suspension to my quilt, I wanted a mechanism that would allow me to take it off, so that if I wanted to put this in the washing machine, I didn't have all of this shock cord and descending rings tossing around in my washing machine. So what I've decided to do is, and this is a prototype, so this is how it's going to function. I've got a snap here. So I'm going to open and close the snap like so. And the snap is, the attachment point is going to be created by folding this over, putting half the snap in there, folding it the rest of the way over so that it'll be like little snap points all the way along the quilt. So we're going to attach these snap points right now. There are 4 parts to the snap assembly. There are 2 caps, one here and one here. There's a stud, which is this one right here. And then there's a socket. So one of the caps attaches to the stud and another one of the caps attaches to the socket. And to attach those, I have one of these tools that is made by Cam Snaps. The instructions for Cam Snap says that you should use an awl to punch a hole through the fabric before inserting the cap, and the cap has a pin end to it. But this webbing, you don't really need to do that because the webbing, you can just poke that right through the webbing. So, you know, using this as my guide, I'm going to fold it over like that. I'm going to put my cap in there so that it's centered. Got it centered. I'm going to put the stud end on. The stud like that. Then I line it up so that the cap is sitting in that base, and I just squeeze. So now that's attached, and I do the same thing to the other side. So I'm just going to use my prototype here as my model. I want this to come right through on the center. That's a little high. Then I'll put the socket end on, and the socket, it's really important that the right sides are facing up. Put the socket on there. Seat the cap in the tool and press. Okay, so now I have my snap attached. And this is what I'll use to attach my suspension. So I'm going to do this on every one. So I'm just going to attach the suspension right off the jig to my quilt. That way nothing gets tangled.